Let me tell you a story. This is the story of a train that disrupted so many lives, uprooted businesses, residents, and had people living in anxiety for a good 3 years. This is the story of the L train. Welcome to Urban Caffeine. My name is Thea, and you're watching a channel that talks about all the trains in New York City. Make sure to hit that like button so YouTube knows to share this video with others. First of all, what is the L train? The L train is one of the few crosstown trains that run the width of Manhattan, the others being the 7 and E. The reason why the L train is so important is because it services so much of Brooklyn and easily connects travelers to all these lines which are important to getting around Manhattan. Back in 2016, where we're going to start our story, the L train had a ridership of about 400,000 per workday. To give you an idea, 400,000 is more than the population of New Orleans or Tampa. During this time, I remember taking the L train during morning rush hour, and it was so full I couldn't even get on. It was so packed that it made sardine cans look like first class. I let 2 more L trains go by before finally deciding to just suck it up and push my way in. My personal record was letting 3 trains go by before forcing my way on the train. The highest record I know of was an old roommate who let 11 trains go by before finally getting on board. So if you think of that situation and figure if trains were coming every 3 to 5 minutes, which would be ideal, then that would mean waiting on the platform anywhere between 33 minutes and 55 minutes. The L train was really that bad. So you can imagine the mass hysteria when on July 2016, the city announced the L train was shutting down for a year and a half. Let's go back a few years to 2012.
Being called a superstorm tonight, Hurricane Sandy.
Hurricane
Sandy devastated New York City. And one infrastructure that was heavily damaged was the Canarsie Tunnel that ran through the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn. To repair this tunnel, there were 2 options. Either the L would have a partial shutdown for 3 years or a full shutdown for 18 months, which was half the time. It was voted that a full shutdown for 18 months would be better. The idea was to just pull the band-aid off, to shut it down and fix it as soon as possible so we could move on with our lives. The proposed shutdown was from the last track of the L train in Brooklyn and all the stations in Manhattan, with the rest of the L train station in Brooklyn still operating. But Manhattan is where most of everyone goes for work. So all this was announced in 2016, and that was the year I decided to move to New York City. I was looking for some places to live in Brooklyn, and when I mentioned Williamsburg to a friend, I was immediately shut down. And this person who texted me didn't even take the L train regularly, but they were well aware of what was happening because it was such a big deal. It was clear that the L train was shutting down for a year and a half, but the problem was that the MTA didn't have a solid plan on what to do for alternative transportation for all those people trying to get to Manhattan. And it's always worrisome when there's no solid plan, especially for something this important, especially for something that transports 400,000 riders in a single day. So everyone was just sitting and waiting to see what the alternatives would be. Because nobody wants to jump the gun and pack up and move out. Moving in New York City is hard, especially if you've found the perfect place for you. It's very hard to find a place that you love. When you move to New York, you're lucky if you find a place right away that you want to stay there for years and years to come. But sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 moves to find the right neighborhood for you. If you're interested to know what renting is like or the process of renting in New York City, I've made a video last week just on that topic. So check it out in the description. So everyone along the L train, both residents and businesses, were just sitting and waiting before making any drastic decisions with their lives. There were even dedicated websites independently made to give the latest news and monitor the situation. And whenever there's a gap in any plan, it's filled up with other people's imaginations. And so alternative transit for the L train was just all over the place. Everybody was pitching in. There were proposed gondolas, a pontoon bridge on the East River, and even a floating bubble bridge. There were even hosted design competitions to find solutions for the L train shutdown, along with lawsuits and threats of lawsuits. I mean, this whole situation was gaining national attention. All the while, the G train was getting optimized to transfer some commuters to the 7 and E trains that will take them to Manhattan. It was very important that the G train would be reliable during the L train shutdown. But in order to optimize the G train, that meant it had to be shut down itself so that it could have maintenance and repairs. So leading up to the planned shutdown of the L train, every weekend, I swear every weekend, that G was shut down, which is awful because it's just such an important train line in Brooklyn. If you want to learn more about the G train, I also made a video on this. Check that out in the description below. As we got closer to the shutdown date, which was April 2019, there was a full-on campaign to let people know that the L was shutting down. There were constantly people at the Bedford station handing out flyers to let people know that this is gonna happen. This is the reality that we are heading towards. The L is shutting down. But there was still no alternatives. There was still no solid alternative plan on how to get people to Manhattan sans the L train. So leading up to 2019, there were two camps of people. Some were not renewing their lease and moving out of northern Brooklyn and Williamsburg. And the second camp were people who were ready to accept their fate and see what would happen. I was borderline between the two, but serendipitously, I did find an apartment that I could afford and was in a nicer location with better public transit. So I just eventually moved out. Otherwise, I would probably still be living in Williamsburg as I speak. The reality of the shutdown was slowly sinking in. And as people were moving out, businesses that relied on customers that took the L train were trying to come up with a plan on how to survive. The MTA also announced boosting the services on the 7, E, and G to help support the loss of the L. Along with this, getting larger ferries that traveled on the East River and getting more buses to help with the load. People were about to buckle in and get this show on the road. But then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it was announced that the full shutdown was not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. Out of nowhere, there was this announcement that this new technology from Europe can be used to repair the tunnel without having a complete shutdown in just under 2 years. I fell off my seat when I read this news. People have uprooted their lives. Businesses were in anxiety and worry for the last 2.5 years. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's this new technology from Europe that has saved the L train. People, honest to goodness, pooped out bricks. We went from a complete shutdown to a slowdown. And then we come to 2020.
Fast-breaking developments in the coronavirus emergency. Coronavirus.
At this point, nobody's really taking the subway, much less talking about it. I'm not gonna lie, depending on where you were in New York City during this time, things were looking bleak. Hundreds of people were dying every day, and it doesn't help that when you look up, you get some Silent Hill vibes. People were living in paranoia and isolation, and through all this doom and gloom, there was this headline that I had to read twice. The L train tunnel repairs were completed ahead of schedule. It's moments like these that I truly believe the world is a funny place and life itself is a humorous spectacle. But I will end with this. The New York City subway is leagues behind transit systems around the world. It's not the best, it's not perfect, it's far from perfect, but it's what we have. So we're all forced to use it since most of the time it's the fastest way to get around the city and the cheapest minus walking or riding a bike. Most people have learned to deal with this, but obviously this shouldn't be the way it is. Because of its imperfections and laughable inadequacies, I have this love-hate relationship with the subway. The subway's like the weather. You can predict how well it's gonna run on certain days, but your prediction is only good 50% of the time. Sure, we have technology and a buttload of apps that we can use, but apps are not always a surefire way to predict if the subway is coming or not, or if there's sudden service changes. The saga of the L train shutdown was so ridiculous that it's hilarious, and all I could do is just laugh at the situation. I would like to know your thoughts on this. Comment below. Were you there during the L train shutdown? Did you move out? Did you wait and see? If you weren't there, what do you think of this? What would you have done? If this topic was interesting to you, I recommend watching the movie The End of the Line, where they did talk about the L train shutdown and Andy Byford, famously known as Train Daddy. I also linked an article that chronologically lists the events that happened leading up to the L train shutdown or non-shutdown. Check those things out in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it with someone you know, because as I've always said, sharing is caring. Thank you all to the Patreon members of Urban Caffeine. If you want to help out this channel while gaining exclusive content, check out patreon.com/urbancaffeine. Thank you all so much for watching, and until the next video, happy New Yorking.